Welcome to the Bible and Theology Matters podcast,
where we discuss all things Bible and theology.
Because it matters. What you really believe determines how you really behave.
Now, here is your host, Associate Professor of Bible Exposition at Dallas Theological Seminary
and Professor of Bible and Theology for the National Theological College and Graduate School,
Dr. Paul Weaver.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is when you are watching or listening to this episode. I'm your host, Paul Weaver, and it's my great privilege to lead conversations, discussions about all things Bible and theology. I'm pleased to have Dr. Frank Turek back on the Bible and Theology Matters podcast. Dr. Turek is a well-known Christian apologist, author, and speaker, recognized for his articulate defense of the Christian faith and his engaging seminars and radio program entitled Cross-Examined. Dr. Turek is the president of crossexamined.org. He is the author and co-author of several books, including Correct, but Not Politically Correct, Stealing from God, and Legislating Morality. He's also the co-author of the influential book we are continuing to discuss in today's episode, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, which explores the rationality of belief in God and in the person of Jesus Christ, as well as the irrationality of atheism. In last week's episode, we discussed the arguments and evidence for the existence of God. We discussed the moral argument. We discussed the argument from design. We talked about the nature of truth and the difference between truth and tolerance. If you missed that discussion, you're sure to want to go back and watch or listen to it first, as our discussion today will be building upon that one. What do you think about Anthony Flew, right? This individual that was an atheist who turned theist, but he died, as best we can tell, never making that next step, right? He concluded that I must go where the evidence leads me, is really what he said, to become a theist.
Yeah, Anthony Flew had several debates with Gary Habermas, the top scholar in the world, I think, on the resurrection. In fact, just last week, Gary's first magnum opus volume on the evidence for the resurrection came out. And Gary, over the years, as I say, had several debates with Anthony Flew, who was probably the top philosophical atheist, or one of the top philosophical atheists of the 20th century. And do you know what really convinced him, Paul, that there has to be an intelligence out there? Was the argument from DNA we just mentioned, that there's got to be a mind out there. Now, he never got, as far as we know, all the way to accepting Jesus, but he went from hard atheism to becoming at least a theist, that there's got to be some mind out there that set all this up and keeps it going. He wrote a book called There Is No God, and the word no is crossed out on the cover. And he said his atheists' buddies all turned on him and called him senile. And what he said to them is, you haven't read a word I've written on this, have you? And they hadn't, right? Because it's not really an issue of the mind, it's an issue of the will. This is why I always ask people on college campuses when I speak, and then we take questions. I always ask atheists or unbelievers when they get up to the microphone, if Christianity were true, would you become a Christian? And most of the time, you know what they'll say? No. And I'll ask them, wait a minute, you claim to be reasonable. How is it reasonable you wouldn't believe something even if it were true? No, it's not about reason. It's not a head problem, it's a heart problem. They don't want it to be true. They don't want there to be a God. Why? Because they want to be God of their own lives. They're not on a truth quest, they're on a happiness quest. And they're just going to believe whatever they think is going to make them happy. Now, here's the problem. You can make yourself happy over the short term, doing a lot of fun, but selfish and sinful things, yet over the long term, it's a disaster. And by the way, everyone listening to us right now who's over 40 knows what I'm talking about, because many of us have tried it ourselves, right? I'm going to do it my way. I'm going to do things. No, you're not. You're not going to last very long doing it your way all the time. How are you going to hold down a relationship if it's always about you, whatever you want to do? You're not. You're not going to be able to do it. And yet people think, I'm just going to do it my way. I don't have to have any moral restraints. No, you want any success in life, as C.S. Lewis put it, quite a lot of restraint is going to be necessary.
Well, that book you referenced is back on my shelf there somewhere. There Is a God, with the no, as you mentioned, marked out, how the world's most notorious atheist changed his mind. And So it's interesting. I find him fascinating, and just comparing him and contrasting him to the so-called new atheist. He's more, would you say, genuine liberal in the mind, in that he's seeking truth, and he's willing to go where the evidence leads him. Now we think there's evidence he didn't make that next step, but would you contrast him a little bit with the new atheist? Would you say that's more an emotional Dawkins, Hitchinson, as you mentioned, who's now in a Christless eternity as best we know? There is more what we call the emotional argument of the problem of evil, not the logical argument. Would you see a distinction there?
Yeah, I do. In fact, I ended both of the debates I had with Hitchens, which, by the way, people can see on our YouTube channel, the Cross-Examine YouTube channel, 2 words, Cross-Examine. I ended both the debates by saying Christopher Hitchens' attitude is, there is no God, and I hate him.
Right.
But God says there is a Christopher Hitchens, and I love him. In fact, I died for him. So, yes, the new atheist attitude, and it really, I think, came out of it came out of 9/11, where atheists lumped all religions together and said they're all evil because of what these people did to us. And they just went on an emotional tirade. They didn't have any new arguments. It's just the same old arguments coded with a kind of bitter attitude about religion in general and religious people in general. Although you may have noticed in recent years, Richard Dawkins, who still is a vociferous atheist and is against religion, has admitted that Christianity might have some practical good effects to resist what's going on in his own country of England as Muslims began to take over there. I mean, a tepid secularism, which doesn't have anything to bind people together with, is not going to resist a rabid Islamic fundamentalism, but Christianity could. And so he's even recognizing the pragmatic benefits of Christianity, even though he would never probably, unless something changes dramatically in his life, become a Christian.
In a couple weeks, we're going to have Alistair McGrath on the podcast and discuss a book he's recently written called Coming to Faith, or edited, Coming to Faith Through Dawkins.
That's right.
And it's that Dawkins' anger and animosity and emotional arguments has led some to come to faith in Christ.
That's right.
That'll be an
Yes.
interesting discussion.
Yes, he's pushed people toward Jesus, which just goes to show you that God can get his will done even when people are against him. God can draw a straight line with a crooked stick. And so when an atheist comes out and writes the God delusion like Dawkins did, some Christians are going to go, I'm going to research what Dawkins has said here, and in doing so, I'm going to get closer to Jesus. I mean, here's a situation where an atheist is actually pushing people to become more like Jesus.
Yeah, we're thankful for everything good that comes out of things meant for evil, even, right? Well, Dr. Turek, up to this point, we've been discussing the existence of God, and that is, of course, a crucial first step to faith in the Judeo-Christian God, and ultimately in the person of Jesus Christ. But belief in God alone is not enough, is it? I have a book on my shelf we mentioned already with Anthony Flew, who is a former and famous atheist. 2004, he became a theist as a result of the evidence. But as far as we know, he never did make that next step to faith in Christ prior to his death in 2010. Well, the rest of your book helps to provide reasonable arguments for that step from theism to biblical Christianity, and it provides helpful arguments that Jesus is indeed who he claimed to be. We can't unpackage all the contents of your book in this relatively short interview, so for our listeners, you want to acquire your own copy, make sure you acquire your own copy. You do have a chapter where you provide the top 10 reasons why we can trust the Bible. Would you run through a few of those for our listeners?
Yeah, it's a chapter, and I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. The top 10 reasons we know the New Testament writers told the truth. First of all, there are 2 questions in apologetics, 2 big questions you need to answer. Does God exist, and did Jesus rise from the dead? Because if the answer to those 2 questions is yes, then Christianity's true. All the logic falls into place, right? But then, in order to discover whether Jesus rose from the dead, you have to ask two more questions. One is, do we have an accurate copy of the New Testament testimony, what the New Testament writers wrote? And then B, the second question is, did they tell the truth? Because we could have an accurate copy of a lie, right? So those are the two questions. And when we talk about the top 10 reasons we know the New Testament writers told the truth, we're answering the second of those two questions. How do we know they didn't lie? Okay. So I think one of my favorite arguments, well, they're all alliterated when I do the presentation. They all begin with the letter E. You know, we have eyewitness testimony, we have early testimony, we have embarrassing testimony, we have excruciating testimony. They went and died for it. There's just 4 out of like 10. My favorite one is probably the embarrassing testimony. And you, Paul, being a New Testament scholar, are very familiar with this, I know. But a lot of people might not have heard of this if they've just casually looked at the New Testament. There's a principle that historians use to discover whether or not someone's telling the truth, and it's called the principle of embarrassment. It goes like this. If there's something embarrassing to the author or authors in the text, it's probably true. Why? Because you're not going to invent things that make you look bad. You might invent things that make you look good, but you're not going to invent things that embarrass you. And I always ask people, and when I'm before a live audience, I'll say, to illustrate this, how many people here have ever lied to make yourself look good? And just about every hand goes up. The few hands that don't go up, I go, if your hand isn't up right now, you're lying to make yourself look good. And we know it's not true. You have lied. And then the next question is, how many people have ever lied to make yourself look bad? And nobody raises their hand. Why? Because you don't lie to make yourself look bad. You lie to make yourself look good. Well, the problem is the New Testament documents, and by the way, this is true of the Old Testament as well, but let's just look at the New Testament. The New Testament documents are filled with embarrassing details they never would have invented if they were making this up. I mean, Peter would never say, I'll never deny you, Lord. And then what does he do? Deny him 3 times. They would never have the women discover the empty tomb. Because women's testimony was not considered on par with that of a man at that day. And it was not only that, it was embarrassing to men. Yet all 4 Gospels say the women were the first witnesses, which can only mean they really were. I actually had a lady come up to me once. She said, hey, Frank, I know why Jesus appeared to the women first. I said, why? And she said, because he wanted to get the story out. I said, that is an excellent point. I hadn't thought about that. You know? Oh, by the way, then the disciples run away at the crucifixion, right? They're cowards. Again, the women are the brave ones. And then there's even embarrassing details potentially about Jesus. In Mark chapter 3, he's considered out of his mind by his own family. They think he's nuts. His own brothers don't believe in him. That was embarrassing. That's John chapter 7. He's called demon-possessed. Do you think they invented that? He's called a madman. He's called a drunkard. He has his feet wiped with the hair of a prostitute, which easily could have been seen as a sexual advance. He's got 2 prostitutes in his bloodline. The Messiah's bloodline. Who's going to invent that? And then he's hung on a tree. And if you're making up a Messiah to the Jews, you don't hang the guy on a tree. Why? Because anyone who's hung on a tree is under God's curse, according to Deuteronomy 21:23. This is not an invented storyline. And for me, this really shows, in addition to the fact that they went and died for this, this really shows this is genuine. Because look, either they're telling the truth or they're not. And there's no motivation to lie about this and then get beaten, tortured, and killed for it. And there's no motivation to make up embarrassing details that might even hurt your case. In fact, think about the one you find in Matthew 28. Jesus has given them the Great Commission in verse 17 about the disciples who are witnessing him give them the Great Commission. It says, some believed, but some doubted. They're doubting, and he's standing resurrected right in front of them. This is embarrassing. They're not inventing this. So there's 10 of them in there. That's just 1 out of 10. But for me, that just kind of seals the deal because I'm naturally skeptical. I'm thinking, yeah, they made this up. No. You have to have a lot more faith to believe they made it up than to believe they're telling the truth. given this evidence.
I find that very convincing also, as you mentioned, for the Old Testament as well, right? You look at ancient Near East documents and literature, nothing's like it. Nothing's honest with the record. They're all
That's right.
A revisionist history, even Sennacherib's prism, where he says, I cooped up Hezekiah like a bird in the cage.
That's
right? That's examples of historiography was not like the Bible. It was to promote the emperor or the king or the ruler, and to make him look good and not highlight anything bad.
You know, it's interesting too. Dennis Prager, I don't know if you know who he is. He's a conservative Jewish radio host and author. And Dennis says, the reason I believe the Old Testament is true is that no people group would invent a history about themselves that embarrassing. Right? The Jews, they get the gold medal in sin, don't they? I mean, how many times do they get rebuked by God and they keep rebelling? My only question for Dennis would be, if embarrassing testimony is good evidence for the Old Testament, why isn't it good evidence for the New? Because he doesn't accept. You know what he said? He said, I don't have a problem with Jesus being the Messiah. I have a problem with Jesus being God. Well, sorry, you got a problem with it. Turns out he was or is God.
Yeah, very much true. The New and Old Testament highlights both the victories, but also the failures of Noah getting drunk and Abraham not believing and David committing adultery and Thomas doubting and Peter denying. So very true. So many people will say that Jesus was just a good moral teacher. And I love the quote that you included by C.S. Lewis, which I often quote as well, where Lewis says that such a statement is just foolishness. C.S. Lewis writes, and I'm quoting, "A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would rather be a lunatic on a level with the man who says he's a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come up with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to."
Yeah, that's brilliant. It's the old lawyer, liar, lunatic trilemma. And when you look at what Jesus actually said and did, it's really hard to conclude that he could be a good teacher and yet claim that he's the great I am, or that all authority has been given to me, or that he and the Father are one, or that if you pray in my name, your sins are forgiven, or any of these things that he said, you go, no mere man could say that and be considered good. He'd either be a lunatic or he's a complete liar, but he's not just a good teacher, right? So the options you have are Lord, lunatic, or liar, and Lord fits best, given also the fact that we have evidence that he predicted and accomplished his own resurrection from the dead. So it just doesn't work to say that Jesus was just a good teacher. You don't go around saying you're the great I am, and you should pray in my name. Imagine if you or I said that. Yeah, pray in my name. I'm the great I am. All authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. People would go, "You're nuts." Right? You're not a good moral teacher. You're not even a good professor if you say that.
And of course, the resurrection seals the deal, doesn't it?
Yes, that's the key event in the New Testament is the resurrection. But it's not the greatest miracle in the Bible. The greatest miracle in the Bible is the first verse. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. If that verse is true, and even atheists are admitting the evidence for it now, that the universe had a beginning. If that verse is true, every other verse in the Bible is at least possible, including resurrections. That's why when people say, I don't believe in miracles, I say, look around, you're living in one. This universe is a miracle. And if that miracle occurred, if God can create the whole universe out of nothing, he can certainly do whatever he wants. It's not logically impossible inside the universe, including resurrecting Jesus from the dead. And that appears to be what he actually did.
Yeah. I teach a Gospels course, and I always remind our students living here in Texas, I say, did you know that Texas is 31 times the size of Israel. Israel is about the size of New Jersey, and Jesus is going to, especially in Galilee, but in Jerusalem as well, performing all these signs and wonders, at least 3 resurrections before his own. And the news of this is spreading throughout. Then they triumphal entry, cry out Hosanna, save us. And, within that week, he's in Passover weekend put to death. But, 3 days later, rises again and appears, as Luke says, for 40 days with many convincing proofs. And, of course, in a land that size and in 50-day period, Pentecost is 50 days from Passover. The world was turned upside down, and you can't create a lie big enough to conceal the resurrection.
Especially not in Jerusalem, where his tomb could have been easily exposed if he was still in it, and his body exposed. Yeah, it's really, by the way, that's one of the other reasons we know they told the truth, the explosive growth of the church out of Jerusalem, which would be the last place you could claim a bodily resurrection if his tomb was still occupied.
Very good. Your friend J. Warner Wallace would call it the fallout, right?
That's right, exactly.
The fallout of the... Well, as we wrap up our podcast, are there any additional thoughts or challenges that you would like to leave our listening audience and our viewing audience with?
Yeah, I would say, especially if you have young people, you've got to get them grounded in the evidence for the faith. Because, look, you might think that the church is going to inform your kids properly about this stuff. And most churches don't. Most churches are not involved in apologetics at all. You may think that, my kid will just find his or her way on their own. Look, if you're not discipling your young person, somebody else is. Probably the iPhone is discipling them. And you need to counter that with truth. They're getting a lot of misinformation. You need to counter it with the right information. By the way, that's why we're on Instagram and YouTube and TikTok and all these places, Cross-Examined is, because we're trying to get the truth to these young people. So you have to make a deliberate attempt to teach people the truth about Christianity. If you go to crossexamine.org, you'll see we have a podcast called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. It's twice a week. We have a TV show. We have several online courses they can take, including the brand new Why I Still Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. We just re-recorded it, brand new workbook, the whole deal. So people can take any of that. They can see almost 2,000 videos for free on our YouTube channel, where we go to college campuses, high schools, and churches and present the evidence that Christianity is true. We have a lot of Q&A up there. We have an app, the Cross-Examined app, 2 words in the App Store. So any of these resources they can get and use, and I hope they do, because it's much easier to inoculate a young person against deception than it is to try and pull them out of deception later.
Very true. Very good. Thank you so much, Dr. Turek. Thanks for taking a substantial amount of time out of your very busy schedule to share with our listeners your wealth of knowledge and experience in the realm of apologetics.
Thank you so much, Dr. Weaver. Appreciate what you're doing at Dallas. In fact, seminaries are so important now because the seminaries determine what the pastors say, and what the pastors say determines quite often what the congregants do. And so what you're doing is you're right at the ground level there. Thank you for what you're doing.
Well, thank you. Our time is up for today's Bible and Theology Matters podcast. But once again, we have only scratched the surface of Dr. Turek's book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. So make sure that you jump online and acquire your own copy, and head over to crossexamine.org to take advantage of other resources that will strengthen your faith and help you and those you love contend for the truth. And if you're a regular listener to this podcast, you know that international missions and leadership development is very near to my heart. I cannot think of a more strategic way to make an eternal impact on an entire country than training its Christian leaders for the work of the ministry. And that is why I'm pleased to partner with the National Theological College and Graduate School as a volunteer professor of Bible and Theology, as well as a board member. NTCGS is a strategically placed college and graduate school with 3 campuses in the Middle East and 1 in East Africa. We are training Egyptians, Jordanians, Syrians, Lebanese, and East Africans in the Scriptures. If you'd like to join me in partnering with NTCGS through your prayers and your giving, go to ntcgs.org. That's ntcgs.org. Thank you so much for your consideration. I hope you'll join us again next week for another great podcast. But until next time, never forget, Bible and theology matters, because what you really believe determines how you really behave.
Bible and Theology Matters podcast is a listener-supported podcast
devoted to helping Christians grow in their knowledge of the Word of God and in their relationship to the God of the Word.
To learn how you can partner with the Bible and Theology Matters podcast,
Visit us at BibleandTheologyMatters.com. That's Bible, A-N-D, TheologyMatters.com.